Okay, so let us look at Ime Ikiddeh's The Vulture's Funeral. This is Ime Ikiddeh's The Vulture's Funeral. It is an important text in Akwa Ibom Indigenous literature. It's a collection of poems. It's a poetry collection. This book is special because it renders a story in verse. It's a narrative in verse. In this work, the story is told using the form of poetry. This is an example of narrative poetry. Ime Ikiddeh's The Vulture's Funeral is an example of narrative poetry. Poetry that tells a story, and we call it a story in verse. A story in verse. The work makes use of a rich oral tradition. So it is very connected to Akwa Ibom oral literature. In fact, this is Akwa Ibom oral literature in the written mode. This is a typical example of what a modern Akwa Ibom literature should look like, where it takes material from an oral tradition to build a story that resonates with modern realities. I was privileged to be taught by Professor Ime Ikiddeh of blessed memory. And this book he has left behind reminds us of what he stands for as a scholar, an academic, as a poet, as a creative writer. And as we study this book, we remember him and everything that he stands for. So this is The Vulture's Funeral and Reincarnation. So this is The Vulture's Funeral and Reincarnation. It is called A Folk Tale in Verse. It's called A Folk Tale in Verse. So Ime Ikiddeh was a professor of literature. Ime Ikiddeh was a professor of literature who in his lifetime traveled the world teaching literature. He was a versatile scholar. I remember once that he taught us modernist poetry. One of the poems he taught us was The Wheelbarrow, as an example of imagist poetry. On this book, it is written about the author. Professor Ime Ikiddeh is a well-known literary scholar with a specialist interest in oral literature. In this book, which begins with an introduction and ends with explanatory notes, the author brings the creative apprehensions of a poet to bear on the skills of a traditional storyteller and the educational impulses of a teacher. The outcome of this fusion of interests is a rich and moving narrative rendered in verse, ending with the simple moral lesson of a folk tale. So, as I've said, this book captures the essence of Akwa Ibom indigenous literature because its material is drawn from the rich oral tradition of the people, and these materials are used in writing the modern tale. So the book is based on the life of birds. The book is based on the life of birds. But as I've always said, notwithstanding the fact that the characters in a work of art are animals, we must understand that those animals refer to human beings and their world and their characteristics. And so, even when we read this book, we read birds, we read about birds and their actions. We must see those birds' actions as the actions of human beings. Okay? So the occasion for the writing of the poem, for the poems in this collection, is the burial of the vulture. Which brings about the gathering of the birds for the burial. Now we know that the vulture's mother has passed away and there's going to be a funeral. All the birds are invited. Now, during the gathering, we see the dramatization of certain events and actions that allude to human society. In reading the book, we appreciate the rich culture of Akwa Ibom people, but not only that, we also appreciate Nigeria's modern history, which is characterized by political instability, coups and counter-coups, plots and schemes. So in the work, you see that while some birds are trying to organize the birds, create order, and seamless operation of society, others are plotting how to destroy the peace in society because of their selfish political interest. So that's how we're going to read the book. So the book has sections, and I'm going to read out the first part that's called Arrivals. And we'll talk about that when we come back. Next class, we'll look at the beginnings. So let us read from Arrivals. When Vulture's mothers died, the birds turned up in flocks to bid farewell to the matriarch, as tradition required, and cheer up the young orphan, his father having some months before gone down the ancestral lane, spewing, choked from the fat of an abandoned slaughterhouse. Today, the weaver bird came with the letters in home design, a decked nest of textile and straw, while swallow, his wings folded neatly on the sides, cut through the air, swift of sheen, like some slim jet bomb. No surprise, Kite arrived late. Muttering, he just had to pick up a small fowl for a snack, though to his eternal anger, the chick turned out to be the merest shrimp of a thing, unfit to be the only child of its poor, frightened mother. As for Pickup, everyone knew it was the same in joy or sorrow, in sunshine and rain, as he splashed the full colors of his plums, planting his tail. For the whole world to adore, especially the peahen, his wife. Cock was not the happiest of guests. As he strutted around today alone, he recalled the last such gathering where some small-minded freaks had whispered they could not trust him for living in human homes and therefore liable to betray the guarded secrets of the birds. Who says the winged ones have no traditions to bind them? Who says the race of plumage congregate only for their gullets? That is the first part of the poem that's called Arrival. It has like an introduction to the poem. It gives us the occasion for the gathering of the birds. The vulture's mother has passed away. Vulture is now an orphan because a few months before the father had passed away. Now the funeral is the occasion for the birds to gather. We are being told of the arrival of each bird in their characteristics and some stories that surround their arrival. For instance, the weaver bird is known for its beautiful design and colorful feathers. And that is how the bird is described in the poem. That means this bird arrives well dressed for the occasion, okay, for the funeral. And then we are introduced to swallow, another bird that has arrived, okay. And we say swallow, his wings folded neatly on the sides, cut through the air, swift of sheen, like some slim jet bomber. What is characteristic of swallow now is how he flies, okay? There's something unique about the way the swallow flies that has captured the poet's imagination, okay? And then in the third stanza, we are introduced to Kite, the arrival of the kite. We are told that the kite arrived late, and we are told that he has this characteristic of arriving late to events or for events, right? That means the kite is known for its characteristic lateness, okay? And then he now gives excuses for why he's late. He had to pick up a small fowl for a snack, okay? Coming to a funeral, but had to branch somewhere to eat first, okay? So it shows how birds are preying on other birds for survival, okay? And if you link that to the human world, you also see that some human beings are preying on other human beings for survival because they are more powerful and better placed, you know. And then though to his eternal anger, the chick turned out to be a mere shrimp of a thing. That means it was not even enough for his meal, okay? It was too small that it was not even enough for his meal. And then we're also told about the arrival of the peacock, the most beautiful of the birds, okay? The feathers suggest happiness, or that is always shining. Full colors of his plums planting his tail. So the peacock is one of the birds that got to the venue of the funeral. And we are told that the peacock has a wife by name Peahen. Okay? And then cock was not the happiest of guests. Cock here is used to refer to domestic birds. Okay? And when we read this stanza, we see discrimination. The discrimination among the birds. Let me read again. Cock was not the happiest of guests. As he strutted around today alone, he recalled the last such gathering where some small-minded freaks had whispered they could not trust him for living in human homes and thereby liable to betray the guarded secrets of the birds. So they don't trust him because while the other birds live in the forest and the sky, he lives in the houses of humans, okay? And so they cannot trust him. So that's discrimination among the birds. In human society, we also have discrimination. Some people are made to feel as if they are not really part of a society, okay? Because of maybe their status or their class. So remember that every reality here points to human realities and not necessarily to the birds. It's just an analogy that's used to represent human society. So at the end, in the last stanza, the poet says, the persona says, who says the winged ones have no traditions to bind them? Who says the rays of plumage congregate only for their gullet? So this means that this is a way of saying that every race has its own culture, including Africa. Africans also have their own culture against what the colonial masters wanted us to believe, that we do not have our culture and tradition. So that's by way of introduction to the poem. When we come back next week, we'll read more and study more of the poem. So have a blessed morning.